Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, and I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Maybe you've heard of the term modern monetary theory being bandied about as government deficits rocket so high they eclipse Jeff Bezos in outer space. Or maybe you've never heard of the term, but MMT could affect your mortgage, your taxes, and your job. I've invited someone to help us understand modern monetary theory. Stephen Globerman is a professor of international business at Western Washington University and also adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I guess we'll start with the obvious, maybe with definitions. So maybe give our audience a definition of what modern monetary theory is.
Well, let me say what the main message of modern monetary theory is. And the main message is that if a sovereign government can borrow money in its own currency, there's no financial constraint on government borrowing because the central bank can simply buy the bonds, the government's bonds, and in the limit, the central bank could forgive the debt and indeed not charge any interest. So the notion that governments are constrained by their ability to borrow is essentially negated by modern monetary theory's premise.
So how did this theory originate? Where did it come from?
Well, it's actually a fairly old theory because in practice, governments historically have printed money to pay for its debts. But the more recent vintage of modern monetary theory really traces back to some work that was done in the late 1980s, early 1990s by actually a financial economist who was working in the finance industry. And it's been picked up by academics over the last, certainly the last 10 years, but it's zoomed into prominence, I would say, in the last couple of years, of course, with the growth in government deficits.
And have we seen politicians kind of embracing this theory?
Well, there's certainly some politicians who embrace it. In the US, most notably Bernie Sanders is a subscriber to modern monetary theory. We haven't seen any prominent politicians in Canada, at least to my knowledge, that have openly welcomed adopting modern monetary theory. And indeed, the governors, the two recent governors, the current and former governor of the Bank of Canada, have explicitly rejected modern monetary theory, as has the head of the Federal Reserve in the US.
But, you know, when I observe, let's say the Canadian government in action, it seems to me that they're kind of implementing modern monetary theory without saying that they're implementing modern monetary theory. Is that going too far?
Well, I think then it's appropriate to draw, or at least to try and draw a distinction between quantitative easing and modern monetary theory, because certainly the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve Bank would say, we are not practicing modern monetary theory, we're practicing quantitative easing. So what's the difference? Really, ultimately, the difference is with quantitative easing, the central bank is buying government bonds, but the notion is that it will resell those bonds in the private sector, or if it doesn't, it's going to go to the government and say, look, we're holding these bonds, they've matured, you have to compensate us. In modern monetary theory, there's no obligation for the Bank of Canada or the Federal Reserve to be compensated by the government. The Bank of Canada or the Federal Reserve can just say, well, let's just forget the whole thing. We'll just write the debt off. And effectively what that means is the Bank of Canada, the Fed, has printed money, given it to the government as an eternal interest-free loan.
Yeah, so I guess we're on to the stage of trying to figure out whether this is a sound economic approach or not.
Yes, well, I mean, ultimately over time, we'll know whether this is quantitative easing or modern monetary theory. But I think the more immediate issue, of course, is if the government is borrowing more money, whether it's borrowing from the private market or the central bank, it's going into the economy and buying labor and buying capital, and it's bidding those resources away from the private sector. So the question is more government spending a good idea or a bad idea? That's really what I think this debate ultimately comes down to.
We're going to have to take a brief break. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Professor Stephen Globerman. He is a professor of international business at Western Washington University and also adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, talking about modern monetary theory, quantitative easing, and various other, you may think, esoteric subjects, but we're going to take it right down to brass tacks now. Stephen, tell us, when I took my Economics 100 class many moons ago, I suppose, as an undergraduate, the specter of rampant inflation, that took place in Weimar Germany when the government there printed money endlessly to try to pay for things, and then you'd have to take a shopping basket full of German marks to buy a loaf of bread. The hyperinflation specter. Why isn't that happening now with all of the money that's being printed up by governments?
Well, that is a good question. And if I had a nice, compact, easy answer, I think someone would nominate me for the Nobel Prize in economics. But the modern monetary theorists certainly point to exactly what you're discussing, which is, look, we've had a pretty substantial growth in the money supply over the last 2 years. We don't see rampant inflation. Well, rampant inflation is a relative term. We are seeing a pickup in inflation. In fact, as you know, we in the US and Canada, we're seeing a very substantial, virtually a doubling in the rate of inflation over the last 3 to 4 months. The modern monetary theorists would say, as indeed the head of the Federal Reserve has said, this is transient. This is a result of bottlenecks created by COVID, and things will be fine 6 months or a year from now. Others are less sanguine about it. So I'm not sure that one can say because things were great 2 years ago when the money supply was increasing, they'll be great a year from now if we continue on the path we're on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the latest inflation tally from Canada released, the June inflation rate was 3.1%. Everybody was cheering that it was down from 3.6% in May, but that still seems rather frothy to me. And of course, you can't be in a conversation in Canada without talking about skyrocketing housing prices. We had the skyrocketing prices in lumber, for instance, which has eased off now, but was a huge issue a few months ago. So there are some signs out there, aren't there?
Yes, and in fact, you raised the housing issue. One of the shortcomings of the conventional consumer price indices is that it tends to underestimate the inflation in owner-occupied housing in particular. And a proper measure of inflation would probably be a good deal higher than what we're actually measuring.
So there could be a problem kind of being pent up in terms of what might be happening as the economy opens up?
Yes, indeed. And of course, the modern monetary theorists would say, okay, well, if we're wrong, if we've underestimated the potential for inflation, well, the government can always raise taxes to reduce private spending and reduce the demand side pressure in the economy. Well, again, one has to be cautious. Raising taxes, reducing government spending are political decisions that they're not easy for governments to make. And so I don't know that one should be sanguine about the idea that, well, if things do go off the rails a little bit, we can get them right back on the rails quite quickly.
Yeah, and obviously there are taxes in Canada and consumption taxes. I think of the carbon tax as a consumption tax. There's no question it's having an impact on prices at the gas pump. So it's not as if the Canadian consumer has been immune to taxes at this particular point in time.
No, of course, indeed. And there are various reasons that tax rates can go up. People demand more government services. But again, I think the point I would want to emphasize is that the modern monetary theorists are, I believe, quite sanguine about the ability of either the central bank or the Treasury, Finance Canada, to be able to spot an emerging inflation problem and head it off at the pass. In 1970, the late 1970s, early 1980s, if you look at the data, the rate of inflation in both Canada and the United States jumped very suddenly and very quickly, and it was very persistent. Now, the modern monetary theorists would say it's a new age. We're more sophisticated about economic policy. It can't happen again.
Yeah.
I'm not quite as sanguine.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Stephen Globerman. He's a professor of international business at Western Washington University and also adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University. Stephen, trying to wrap my mind around where our political system is at. You've been obviously observing not only the economy and what the central bank is doing. Any signals from Finance Canada? Chrystia Freeland, our finance minister, she had her budget just a few months ago, and there was a lot of talk about whether there was going to be a so-called fiscal anchor or not. Where do you see things going with the Finance Department of Canada right now?
Well, there's certainly a lot of pressure coming from academics for the finance department to adopt some type of fiscal anchor, as you call it, or fiscal rule, rather than having all spending kind of be discretionary parliamentary discretion. I'm not optimistic about that, frankly. I don't think any politician wants to tie their hands when it comes to spending, because there's a constituency for spending, and it really is going to take a kind of a legal, a new legal regime to get Parliament to tie its own hands when it comes to spending, and I don't see that happening.
Yeah, it's been really tough for parliamentarians, frankly, to even ask the right questions because Parliament as an institution, there was part of the lockdown, a lot of Parliament was virtual, so the oversight functions were really tough to do. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has calculated just in a recent report that unless there is a change of position or a change of stance, that Canada will be in deficit until at least the year 2070. Does that sound sustainable to you?
On its face, no, it's unlikely to be sustainable, because even though the Canadian government can borrow in Canadian dollars, no one, including people in Canada, are obliged to hold Canadian dollars. And that ultimately is the discipline on government spending, is when the marketplace decides that it no longer wants to hold the sovereign currency because its value is questionable, and that really ultimately has been the discipline on any government that's tried to implement MMT. So the short answer is I don't think it's sustainable, but how do we get to a sustainable position is really the issue.
Yeah, I'd love to get thank you for that. I'd love to get your sense of the interplay between what's going on in the United States and what's going on in Canada. You've got a great vantage point for that with your work at Western Washington University as well. So obviously the Biden administration wants to have a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure program. That's what they're pushing through Congress right now. Is there a difference in approach with the Biden administration versus the Canadian government, or is it basically the same kind of approach to these things?
Well, besides the obvious difference that in the US, you have a congressional system where the party in power really has to negotiate at some point, unless they have a clear dominant majority, which the Biden administration does not. I would say that if anything, the debate in the United States about government spending is probably in some ways less critical than it is in Canada. I think Canadians are doing more questioning about the deficit than people in the United States are doing, and that's a change from certainly what I've seen in the past.
Is there any advantage in the United States because they are, in effect, the world reserve currency? Does that help their situation?
It certainly does, although again, there's a real question as to whether that can persist. I mean, at one point, Great Britain had the world's reserve currency, and over time lost that privilege, in part because of economic policy. So sure, it's an advantage for the US now and going forward, but reckless economic behavior could change that.
We're speaking with Stephen Globerman. He is professor of international business at Western Washington University and also an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University, just about the current fiscal climate. We started talking about modern monetary theory. We've veered away from that, but it's a very interesting discussion. Stay with us as we conclude our discussion. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. We're going to continue our discussion with Professor Stephen Globerman. Stephen, this might be a little bit out of the blue, but I wanted to get your sense, with the kind of the rise of cryptocurrencies, how you see the impact of that, specifically the impact of the monopoly of government fiat, their currency, versus having this disaggregated, decentralized currency. Is this a future factor, or am I blowing it up right now?
Well, that's a good question. And of course, I can only give a speculative answer because it's very likely that private cryptocurrencies are going to be heavily regulated, and or the central banks themselves will create cryptocurrencies. I mean, there are really two dynamics going on. One is that it's just more efficient to use cryptocurrencies for reasons that are probably familiar to a lot of the viewers. It's blockchain technology is potentially a lot more efficient than the current financial system. So in that context, we might see cryptocurrencies emerge because they're just more efficient. But whether government keeps their hands off and allows private monetary systems to function and flourish is an open question. And my guess is that there's going to be a lot of regulation as there is emerging, for example, in China, where the central bank of China is going to really have a monopoly on cryptocurrency. And that may likely happen in other countries as well.
So where does that leave us? We're trying to emerge out of COVID with varying degrees of success. There may well be another wave, who knows, hopefully not, at which point we can look to a bounce back. I saw some statistics today from the UK indicating that they'll be the leader of the G7 in terms of their economic growth. I think they're looking at 7% perhaps for this year, which is just phenomenal. But it's all lumpy. I don't think anybody in Canada expects that kind of growth in any time in the future. So where do you see all this going?
Well, where I see it going is coming to a head to where citizens in all developed countries, but certainly if we're talking about Canada, citizens are going to have to make hard decisions about what the proper role of government is. And this is certainly the debate that's going on. The modern monetary theorists see a much larger productive role for government in all kinds of areas, including a guaranteed annual income. And critics of modern monetary theory say we have to get back on a productivity growth path. And the only way to do that is to constrain government to do what is really appropriate and necessary for government to do. And that's the debate. And I see that as a major debate over the next few years.
Yeah, we've got about a minute left, and I would concur with you. I mean, I think it's going to be very interesting to see whether the case can be made that, all this comfort level with government intervention, whether that is a long-term trend or not. I mean, the issue is, people are used to government intervening now. Can they be weaned off that? Is that how you see it as well?
Yes, I do see that, and as I say, I think that that's certainly the focus of the debate, and we'll see what happens. I share your view that is what needs the public's attention, and I also share your concern that maybe the public needs to be better informed to participate intelligently in the debate.
20 seconds left. Do you hope that this becomes a topic for the next federal election?
Absolutely. That's my short answer.
That's a good short answer, less than 20 seconds by far. Stephen Globerman, thank you again for being part of this program. Very interesting insights, and we'll be following it very closely. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Lots to chew on there. Stephen Globerman, as I said, a professor of international business, talking about this concept of modern monetary theory, how it intersects with quantitative easing, which has been an approach by central banks since the financial crisis. A lot of money being printed, a lot of money being loaned, a lot of money being spent. What its impact is on inflation, taxes, and your job, we are going to be following very closely. But thanks for watching today.